Hello, this is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
And this is Carly.
Welcome to the making and the remaking of a codependent mind.
This is our first episode of our guest season. Carly has been nice enough to reach out and provide a story, and we're going to talk about her story on this episode.
That's right. We're going to hear about another making and remaking of a codependent mind.
Yeah.
Because, like we said before, there are lots and lots of commonalities in terms of people's experiences and the behaviors that came from those experiences and the effects that those behaviors had on their lives. But there's also really interesting and compelling differences about how people have pulled themselves out of the trauma and the resulting codependent behaviors that they formed in response to that trauma. So welcome, Carly.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Stephanie and Brian, for inviting me along and, for sharing your story over your last few seasons. I want to express that the episodes and seasons you have done prior to this have been a huge part in the remaking of my mind and in opening up vocabulary, words, ways to identify what is actually happening inside of my relationships, inside my life. And so, I just want to thank you for the educational insight that you have provided to me, and I'm sure to many others.
That means a great deal to us, and we really appreciate you saying that. We have to say that even though it's Brian's story and we're the ones doing the podcast, it's been a similar learning journey for us doing the podcasts.
Yeah.
Being in dialogue with other people about what has happened to you, I think makes a huge difference. So again, we really appreciate you bringing your voice here and sharing it with the listeners, because I think it will have a similar effect.
Yeah, and the things that you wrote in your write-up, there's already new vocabulary that I like and will probably use from here forward.
So let's talk about that. Let's start talking about your story. And you described for us a somewhat chaotic childhood. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I want to give a little bit of context. So I was the fourth born out of four siblings, and I only have one sibling that shares the same mother and father. And so my oldest sibling, she was my father's oldest child, and her mom died when she was a year and a half old. So that left my father to be a widower at 19 years old. And I think that brings a lot of context to my story. It kind of lays a big tone on the picture. So I was born in a very small town, and I was actually conceived a year after my parents had been divorced. So it was kind of like they got back together to talk about, I don't know, child support or something. And I was conceived. And so my mom really permanently, I guess not permanently, but my mom left the house when I was 2 years old. And so I was raised primarily by my father, who was in a lot of ways unavailable. He was very deep in addiction, very deep in mental illness, and I didn't ever really know him to be employed. And so we were a family on welfare. And my oldest sister, the one that her mother passed away when she was very young, she was like 14 when I was born. So really, she was my primary caregiver and probably the most stable person in the household. So that was kind of my beginnings.
That's hard.
Yeah.
It was hard, but we survived. And I always kind of had to fend for myself because my oldest sister, she did end up, getting married, having children when I was about 3 years old. And so I learned at a very young age how to cook eggs and how to take care of myself, do my own laundry, things like that. And I was kind of, I was a rebel. I was difficult. I'm going to take that back. I wasn't difficult.
Were you told you were difficult?
No, I think that I just told myself that because I was often getting in trouble and acting out. And I think that a lot of that was for attention that I wasn't getting in the ways that I needed. So I would find ways to get attention.
I'm wondering if this is going to be a thread, because we've heard Brian describe himself because he was described as a difficult baby. And then our first guest, we heard Jason also describe himself as a needy and demanding child. And now you're talking about this story that you had about yourself and your childhood, that you were the problem, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I was ever necessarily like told that, but it was a story that I crafted in my own mind. And, I've listened to you guys talk to Jason and as well your story, Brian, about that. And it really opened me up to thinking like, maybe I wasn't the problem, right? There was a lot of other problems going on and I was responding and reacting to those things.
Right.
And it's almost if it's easier to think of yourself as the problem than to challenge the people in your life for not caring for you the way that they should have been.
Yeah, it was much safer for me to tell myself that I was the problem because I could handle my own reaction as compared to if I was to tell my father that he was the problem, that reaction may have been very scary. And who knows, at that age, it's like, you don't know if you're going to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you assumed you were the problem. Yes, I can relate to that.
There's a physician I've mentioned before, Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
I'm not, huh?
He says that there are two basic human needs: the need for attachment and the need for authenticity. And if we're challenged to choose one, we always choose the need for attachment, which makes sense, of course, because when we're young, before we know how to make our own eggs, the attachment to our caregivers is critical for our survival. So we give up our authenticity in order to maintain that attachment.
Yeah, I can identify with that a lot. And I think that plays into how my, preteen and teenage years turned out, because in my home, I saw my father happy when drugs and sex were involved. So, when I knew that the bag was full of drugs, my dad was happy. I started beginning to put these things together. When his supply ran out, he was not. He was asleep. He was angry. When women were over, he was happy. When they were not, it was very empty and a sad environment. And so at 9 years old, I began doing drugs and I began having sex because those are things that I thought were a source of happiness and a source of purpose.
And maybe safety as well.
Yes. Yeah. It was a way that I could feel close to my dad and maybe even understand him and also understand my mom, because even though I didn't see much of her, she was in and out of our lives. I knew that the story or the narrative was that she was a drug addict. And so I believed that she chose drugs over us. And so I had like a desire to understand, what is the hype? Like, what is the deal with these drugs? Like, they're clearly more valuable than I am, And so I wanted to understand that and feel that. And I think that once I began partaking in those two things, it catapulted into some pretty intense behaviors, because then as I began sharing those things with my friends or with other people, I started to be liked. People wanted to hang out with me. I had the drugs. I had my body, and I was willing to give and share. And it was a way that I sourced love and acceptance from people.
It was a tool, and it worked.
It did. It worked.
It also, unfortunately, kind of probably confirmed what you felt about yourself and in relation to the world, that you needed these things in order to get love.
Correct. Yes. It affirmed my narrative that inherently I was not enough and that I needed to leverage something more than myself, something outside of myself, in order to be enough.
So originally these things and these behaviors solved a problem that you were in an unstable and unsafe environment and were not getting the love and attention that you needed as a child. So they solved that problem, but then they started to create other problems in your life. They were not good solution long term.
Correct. And I think it solved two problems for me, which was, acceptance and love from other people. But it also helped me to feel or not feel things, because we're talking chemicals, right? And when I would get high or I would get drunk, or even when I would light a cigarette, I would feel a relief of my anxiety. I would feel a relief of my anger. It began to be a tool that I used for leveraging love, but also for leveraging sanity and for bringing peace into myself. So it became a big necessity quickly for me.
I had that same experience with alcohol at times where even though it was kind of a small window for me most of the time where I actually felt that relief, it gave me that, and I knew it was going to give me that from whatever chaos was going in my head. And I didn't really even realize it was chaos, but just somehow I was just like, well, this works. And it did. Yeah. Like you said, I mean, it does to some extent.
Yeah, especially at first, right? When we're first doing it and we don't have a tolerance built up, it's like it quickly creates a change in internally. But once that tolerance gets built up, it's like then the desperation starts to peak and frantic. And I actually, when I was 10 years old, I didn't have any drugs, and my friend and I got into my dad's medicine cabinet. And we each took a pill, didn't feel anything, took another pill, didn't feel anything. And we ended up emptying 2 bottles of pills. And unknowingly, they were trazodone and muscle relaxers. So in total, I took 16 and a half pills. And we were like jumping on the trampoline, and then we started to feel it. And I don't know how long we laid on the couch in my living room before my sister found us, but it seemed like hours. And I couldn't move. I was a vegetable, but my mind was able to work. I was thinking, I'm dying. Like I am dead. And it was one of these scariest things of my life. But it was because of that desperation. I wanted to get high, and it wasn't working, so I just kept taking more. Yeah, it was absolutely terrifying, but I survived it.
So I relate to this too, in that you're saying basically you had this combination of things, this need for others to love you or even just like you. And then this,
which we all have.
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, that is a need,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Yeah. But kind of an overwhelming need to where I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if it's being inauthentic. And then this not wanting to listen to your emotions and wanting to mask them or hide them or avoid them with the drug use.
Yeah.
So you had this relationship with alcohol and with sex, and that they were tools to both access love, as you say, access attention that you both needed and deserved to have, but also ways to numb the emotions, the terrifying emotions that you would be feeling on a regular basis. Did that play out in your romantic relationships as well as you got older, that they became spaces to access love and attention, but also spaces to escape certain emotions?
Yes. So I started having relationships at a pretty young age, and I was often introducing these 2 tools to my partners. So, they were often virgins or often, people that hadn't been high before, and so I would introduce them to these things. For me, it was almost like chasing a high. So I've referred to myself before in the past as a womanizer. I realized that I was gender fluid at a young age, meaning I didn't necessarily identify with either male or female, but I knew, even my first grade teacher was a woman, and I knew I was attracted to women and not to men. And so, and my family was affirming of that. There was no problem there. In fact, there was some dysfunction there of my dad saying, yeah, it's fine if you bring women home, just as long as you bring one home for me as well. And I mean, that's when I'm a very young teenager. But it became this thing of a chase, because what I was looking for was love and acceptance, and to escape my feelings of, I think, rejection a lot from my mother. And so I would chase a person, and then once I got them into bed, then I would become disinterested, because I had achieved their love. I had deemed myself worthy because I was able to, air quoting here, conquer.
So that was the high.
It was the high.
And it was all downhill from there.
Correct. Once I had achieved that high with that person, I was ready to move on to the next, because the next high with that person would not be as much as I needed it to be. But it's kind of funny because, well, actually, it's not funny.
I say that all the time.
Yes, you do that.
It's interesting because although I would discard them as my main, I guess, target, I would keep them close so that I would still have that as a source if I needed it. And I could draw a parallel here with drugs. It's like, even though I had that strand, I would be going primarily after a new strand, a different feeling, but I would keep that strand in my drawer for, say, if I failed at, air quote, conquering the next one. So I kept people at a very tight grip, but at an arm's distance.
How did you understand that behavior at the time? Do you remember? How would you explain it to the people you were leaving, and to yourself, why you were continually leaving people?
I don't think that I understood it at the time, but I think that my behavior was, I think the word stoic. I would be just untouchable. And I think this is where some codependent behaviors come in, as well as narcissistic behaviors. And I think in one of your most recent episodes, Brian expressed this, that he would have these codependent behaviors, but there would also be these narcissistic actions. And so I would codependently like reel them in. I would be a chameleon. I would do whatever it was that I needed to please this person and to get them to love me and all of this. And then once I achieved their love, then I would narcissistically just become cold and untouchable. I would essentially say, like, why are you making such a big deal out of this? It's not, it wasn't love. It's, this is casual. This is not everything that I said it was in the beginning. And it was very gaslighty. And I didn't understand that I was doing those things at the time, but I had a desperate need to get my next fix. And so I would do whatever it took in order to answer that calling inside of me. And I hurt a lot of people doing this. When I began doing the 12 steps and it was time to make amends, I had a list.
It took a while.
Yeah, well, it did. And there was quite a few people, rightfully so, that didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear a word from me. And I accept that because my behaviors were very harmful to myself and to many others.
I just saw a meme on Instagram that is relevant, and the Brian and I talked about. It was talking about narcissism and codependency, and warning that once you start reading about narcissism, you're going to recognize some behaviors, but that doesn't make you a narcissist. It just means that narcissism, like codependent behaviors, comes out of trauma. Some of these behaviors are shared between people who we would describe as having narcissistic personality dependency and people who are having codependent.
A lot of them are kind of similar. We've been having these conversations a lot lately, trying to, because we did a whole episode on it in the first season, codependency and narcissism. But I remember thinking at the time it was more like branches on a tree. The same trauma can result in the two, and then they just diverge from there, and they're like way far apart in style. But there's a lot of crossover, I think, between codependency and narcissism.
There is.
I would agree with that. And I also, I was having these thoughts after we had connected, and I was trying to decide how to write my story, because there was so much of this crossover and I was confused. And I remember being like, am I a narcissist? And it was messy. And then I think the most recent episode you guys had released, where Brian had said there was this crossover, I felt this wave of I guess I felt seen. I felt like I'm not crazy. I'm not that unicorn out there that nobody understands or whatnot. And I felt an acceptance that it's okay that these two behaviors were existing inside of me.
Yeah, you didn't break the code. It's not one or the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds very much like a freeze flight response. That moment when you're post high, that you have that panicked feeling of what lies before you and the need to go back to that chase and the high that results from it.
Yeah, and there could have been other elements too that you didn't even realize too, that you didn't want to get too close because of the emotional avoidance. I was afraid of intimacy without knowing I was afraid of intimacy. I thought I was all about it, but I just had so much unresolved shame that it was just too hard to imagine that stuff coming up. And so if I started feeling as though I was getting close to someone, then it's like, well, just kind of unconsciously back away or sabotage or something like that. There could have been some elements of that also.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned masking in the write-up that you did do and you shared with us.
That's a great term.
It is a great term. Can you talk a little bit what that felt like for you, what that looked like, this masking that you've done for a lot of your life?
Yeah, I can. So I took theater in high school, and I remember this, I don't know, it feels like spiritual or like psychological moment where I could see myself in my mind with a mask on. And I remember like going through this motion of me like getting my fingers underneath the mask under my chin and starting to like pry it up. And it got to a point in this vision in my mind where I could get up to my nose, but I would not or could not allow myself to take the mask all the way off, even for myself. So I think that masking for me is part of the stoic type of demeanor I tried to hold. I wanted to be untouchable, unharmable. I wanted to be strong because I viewed my emotions and my needs as weak. And so I would wear a mask to everyone, including myself, because I couldn't be weak. and I wouldn't allow myself to be weak. So I really practiced at being cool and untouchable, and I mean, getting in trouble in school, getting detention, and I didn't even care. A good example of this is that I had mentioned before this overdose I had. Well, my sister, the one that is the second youngest, we have both the same mother and father. She's 3 years older than me. She's the one that found me. So she was 13 when she found me a vegetable. And I didn't talk to her about that event until I was in college with her at like 19 years old. So that's 9 years where I didn't talk to her or even my father, anybody in my family about it because I was masking. And the truth is that throughout those 9 years, I absolutely hated myself for what I had done to my sister. And I think this is a key thing right here. I hated myself for what I had done to my sister, not what I had done to me. I didn't love myself enough. I didn't value myself enough to be upset that I almost killed myself. But I was incredibly upset that I had caused my sister that kind of harm. But I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell her that. And then on what I called the death anniversary, which was the day that I had overdosed 9 years before, I took her flowers and I gave her an apology. I apologized to her for what I had done. And I mean, she stood back and was like, what? You don't need to apologize to me. Like, this wasn't about me. Oh my gosh, and she was very graceful about all of it. But that very big pivotal moment in my life, a huge event where I had nearly died, I masked that for 9 years. And that masking was encouraged in my family. I wasn't encouraged to talk about that. I wasn't encouraged to talk about my emotions or how I was doing or why that happened, why I took all those pills. No, that wasn't a conversation.
That was my experience, my family too. Yeah. There was no check-ins. Yeah. The question was never how are you feeling? It's just what's going on, if that. Like, how was school? Not how are you feeling today?
Or like, what's your problem?
Right, because I had lots of problems throughout my life that were very visible to my whole family, but nobody asked about it.
Another saying that I like from Dr. Gabor Mate is you don't need drama for trauma, but you had some drama. This was a pretty big hole that you started in. And was there a tipping moment for you, or what did your path getting out of this hole look like?
Well, as far as this hole goes, I think there's some layers. So we can just start with maybe sobriety. I was early 20s, at most 80 pounds. I was without a home, without a license, without a car. I hadn't had a job in a couple of years. I was in really rough shape. My drug addiction was deep. And I don't know how, but my sister, the one that found me when I had overdosed, she called me and I had been up for days. And, she said, Carly, I can't stop you from doing what you're doing. There's nothing that I can do about it. I don't want you to be living this way, but if you have children, I will take them. And I remember sitting at that table, having that conversation with her. I think the thing that made it so powerful coming from her is that we were the kids together in the toxic place, of our childhood. And for her to call me as an adult and say, if you have children, I will take them. It shined a light on my behavior. And
it's almost like she was saying that she would have wanted to rescue you and herself.
Yes.
And so if there were any other children that were going to be brought into the situation, she was going to try to rescue them in the ways that you both were not rescued.
She was going to be the adult that we were praying for. Which she totally is, by the way. Like, she is the adult that we wanted as kids. And I am too. I am becoming that adult, which is super rad.
That is.
It is, yeah. So within days of that conversation, I happened to run into somebody that lived in another town, which happened to be the town that my grandma lived in. And I said, when are you going back to that town? And they said, tomorrow. And I said, if my bags are packed, can I catch a ride with you? And they said, yes. And I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell my dad. I didn't tell anybody. I just got in that car and went to my grandma's house, and she took me in. I started cleaning up my act, got a job, put on some weight, and I had quite a few relapses over the next, I don't know, maybe 5 years. But I started allowing myself to have a better life. I started working on finding some type of value in myself and some type of love. And so that's kind of how I got out of the drug addiction. Today I have almost 5 years sober off of dope, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's nice.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
As far as, getting out of the hole of maybe all of this codependent behavior, especially like on the side of my quote unquote womanizing, I spent 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years single. I bought a house. I moved into that house, and my alcoholism was really, really bad at that point, but I stayed away from chasing the other high, which was finding the love from people. And so that 4 or 5 years really had a big impact on me, and learning how to be okay with just myself and with loving myself.
What did that look like? Because, we hear that a lot. You have to love yourself. You have to learn how to love yourself. And the lucky among us, myself, for instance, I learned to love myself mostly by being loved, and I learned to take care of myself by being taken care of in my childhood. I can imagine it's a little more challenging. Not that you weren't loved. I'm sure there was love for you, but it doesn't sound like it was effectively expressed. You were not taught by your parents, for instance, or how to love yourself. So what did that look like as an adult trying to?
So I think that you nailed something that I'd like to mention, which is that I was loved. My folks loved me a lot. All of us. They loved all of us a lot, but their love was impeded. There was a big rock in the way of that water getting to us, whether that was mental illness or drug addiction, whatever that rock was, it impeded their love to us. And I think that a lot of times in codependency, the person that's not receiving the love thinks that that rock is their responsibility to move. And it's not. That's the person that owns that rock. It was my parents' job to move that rock for themselves, whether that be through therapy or whatever. It wasn't my job. So I think that's a really big thing to realize.
And I think that's a great image, because I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of the codependent behaviors are exactly that. I need to move this person's rock, and then the love and the care and the attention and the safety will flow. And it's just impossible to move other people's rocks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like me teaching myself to try to calm my dad's anger, basically, as being like my main goal as an early child. Yeah, because he wasn't going to do it.
But it was his responsibility to do it, right?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
That's what he owns, that rock. And I have to give credit to Glennon Doyle. I can't remember which one of her books or podcasts, but she talks about that metaphor and refers to it as love being impeded. And so I didn't come up with that myself. I learned that from Glennon.
You articulated it well.
Delivered it well, yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. So as far as learning how to love myself, I think there were a few things at play. Number one is that I ended up joining a church and joining a band and having a weekly, or sometimes multiple times a week, check in with a community of people that were seemingly healthy and showed me love and accepted me in most ways. But I've started to feel this belonging with people that worked jobs and had children and loved their children, and they paid their bills, and they would be challenged with situations and they would deal with them in ways that weren't just straight anger and tantrums, which was what I had been shown. And I started to have examples in my life of people that were seemingly healthy. And I think that I started to learn from them and started to practice those things myself. So changing my environment and the circle that I ran in was huge. Also, doing things and following through. For example, buying a house. I was pretty young when I bought a house, and, people that I had talked to about me doing this, they were like, I don't know, Carly, like that kind of have a bad track record. Are you sure you want to buy a house? That's some pretty deep debt. You haven't been sober that long, and so on and so forth. But I did it. And I paid my mortgage and I paid my bills, and I began to see that I could be relied upon. I could rely on myself to do these things without somebody next to me in bed and without a pipe in my hand. I will say that there was still a bottle in my hand, but for some reason maybe not just for some reason, socially, it seemed like that was more normal and that was more okay to be drinking through it instead of being high through it. And so yeah, I started to build trust and follow through and show myself that I could.
It's really the scaffolding process, right?
Mhm.
You just have to layer by layer, you test, you build another layer, you test it out, it holds.
Yeah, right. You survived this one, you survived that one.
Right. We've, I think, used the kind of metaphor before, just like building your muscles. You just got to do it every day, work it out.
And then you had to start getting in touch with your emotions in a real way too throughout this process.
Yes. And that was scary. And I think that I kept the mask on through a lot of it. But I started allowing myself to see under my mask more, and not just convincing myself that I was untouchable, but actually being like, okay, this stuff does hurt. And I do need to deal with it. And, or I need to learn how to sit with it and how to respond instead of just react through these other tools. So yeah, slowly but surely I started revealing my true face to myself, and am still doing that.
Yeah, not running away as soon as something is painful, just because you taught yourself that you can't handle it for whatever reason.
So giving up on some of these tools that were not serving you any longer, and then finding a community of people that told a different story about yourself and a different story about the possibilities of your life. And then also doing things that revealed to yourself that you were a trustworthy person, a reliable person. Those all sound like components of this process for you.
Yes.
I think one thing people struggle with as they start on their healing journey, or however we want to describe it, and they start to work on giving up these tools that are not maybe serving them, I think when people struggle with maybe not having enough hope that it will be better on the other side. So they are tools, as you say, for relief and for comfort, whether it be alcohol or codependent behaviors or sex. And to give them up, you have to have some amount of faith that it will be better going forward. Has that been your experience, that it has been better?
Yes. It's kind of like choose your hard, because both ways are hard. It's hard to recognize a codependent behavior, stop, see it, identify it, and then course correct. That is hard.
It is, right.
But it's also hard to maintain relationships where I am constantly being a chameleon or constantly trying to predict somebody else's needs and belittling my own. So both directions are hard, but I think that breaking these patterns, living sober and just starting to learn my authentic self, and I think believe that my needs are equal, or have this equal value to other people's needs, is the path that promotes personal growth. I think the other path promotes entanglement, mess, chaos, confusion. The other hard is a web, a tangly web that's very suffocating, whereas this path of breaking the mold, I think, does the opposite. It untangles. It allows breath. Like when I get out of a scary moment where I had, recognized my behavior and stopped and course corrected, I come out of that breathing deeper and standing a little taller. And my heart is pounding because that was the scariest thing ever that I just did. But on the other side, I'm so proud.
There's achievement on the feeling of pride and achievement.
Yeah.
Versus the other hard seems inevitably to lead to shame.
Yes.
Yes.
And when you talk about the two types of hard, in my experience, it seems like the old way, the codependent way, was harder. There was a lot more work involved in these stories that I was constantly telling myself, and the lies I was telling, and keeping these lies straight. Who would I tell who, what, and and the emotional avoidance. Oh, I'm feeling this pain. I don't want to feel that, so I have to avoid it. There's so much unnecessary work.
But you were good at it.
I was doing it for I was good at it, but good in that it resulted in the
right.
What I was looking for, which was to just keep myself safe in each tiny little situation, the way I taught myself to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Times when my wife and I have talked about some of these behaviors, and I've, expressed to her all of the thoughts that I went through trying to please her and answer the way that I thought she wanted me to answer. She's like, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
Yes, it is so exhausting. And so I think that you're right, Brian, that I think that other way, it may be harder. And I think that I'm still in a phase of breaking that mold. And it's pretty hard. It's pretty challenging to say, you know what? That was a lie. This is actually my truth. And having the faith that that truth will be accepted.
Or if it's not accepted, that you will survive regardless.
Yes, right.
Yep. And I love that you bring that up, because I think in another episode you guys had mentioned when Brian would do these things, he'd be like, okay, like, I survived. I didn't die. What, did I think I was going to die? Like,
yeah, felt like yeah.
Yeah, it felt like I was going to die, but disappointing somebody and walking away from it and being like, I'm gonna be okay, and they're gonna be okay, and like nobody's gonna die here.
Yeah, and then that may have took 5 minutes of facing fear instead of 5 minutes of giving into the fear, and then 10 years of the consequences of not just spending 5 minutes in facing the fear.
So you mentioned your wife.
Mm-hmm.
So you've managed, we now know, at least once, to not run away. What was different about this time that allowed you to stay in a relationship and commit to a relationship in a way that you had struggled to for so long?
I think a big part was that I was sober, and fully sober. I was in a program. I had a sponsor. I was not drinking. I wasn't escaping my feelings in that way. And so that's how our relationship started. For the first year and a half of our relationship, I was entirely sober. And also this person, my wife, was what I would air quote call healthy. She saw my behaviors once she started realizing that I was people pleasing and not being authentic. She would say, why are you doing that? Like, I want to know you. I don't want to know what you're trying to create to please me. And so I think that she called me to a higher place. She wanted to know me. She wasn't just okay with me pleasing her and being what she needed. And I think that made a big difference. And I also think that I had done a lot of work in the chapter of my mom. And it's hard for me to even talk about this because that you had mentioned the term hole. Like, how did you get out of that hole? And that felt like the hole that was inside of my body that was missing was my mom. And so when my relationship with my wife started, I was actually my mom's, what do you call that? payee, representative payee. So she was receiving in money from Social Security disability, and that money was coming to me, and I allotted the money to her, paid her bills, things like that. I was also her landlord. She was living in my home. We were also getting sober together. There was these things that were happening, and then I met my wife. I moved in with my wife, and then a little while later, I'm still her payee. My mom's payee. She's still living in my house. I'm still managing her bills and things like that. And I go over to the house one day and I can tell that she's high. And I confront her, and within a few months, I had kicked her out and signed over my rights and said, like, you gotta go. And so for the first time in my life, I told my mom that she had to leave. Whereas I had always felt left prior to that. So that was huge, because the work that I had been doing allowed me to love myself enough to say, I'm filling this hole now. I'm filling a hole inside of me that my mom was never capable of filling and still isn't. And so I think that was very catapulting into me being able to have a quote unquote functioning relationship with my wife.
That's a very hopeful story. I want to touch on your experience with the 12-step programs. Did not particularly work for Brian, but a lot of people find them very helpful.
At least not at the time.
If you did find them helpful, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that to those people who may be thinking about joining either CODA or AA or some community, a 12-step community.
Sure, yeah. So I have not experienced CODA. As a young child, I was like the kid out there dancing on the floor at the Halloween party for their Narcotics Anonymous group, so I was very familiar with the rooms and, the environment. And so I knew that was a place I could go to. And I did, and I was going to a meeting every day. I got a sponsor. I was active on like the pool league at the club that I was going to meetings constantly at. I was on their pool league, and it was so fun, and I found community there. And I worked my steps twice, once with one sponsor and once with another. And I needed it. I needed that rigidity in the beginning. I needed the do the steps or die MFer type mentality. I needed I needed to hear the stories. I needed to be reminded by the person coming in the room that was fresh. I needed to see that to remind myself of where I don't want to go back to. I also needed to talk about it and be proud of myself and say, yes, I have 6 months sober. I'm so excited. Everyone clap, give me a chip. And I needed that so bad. And it served me for a long time. I think that as I started to love myself and started to be confident that the alcohol and the drugs no longer controlled me, I started to see the rooms a little different. There was a lot of war stories coming in. There was a lot of dysfunctional teachings, even how the 12 steps are worded. I listened to the 12-step episodes you guys have done, and I was like, oh my gosh, some of the wording is kind of scary.
Yeah, defeatist a little bit.
Yeah. It started to feel very rigid. And I think like a year and a half into sobriety, I decided that I wanted to try to drink. And my sponsor was like, I cannot be okay with that, and I cannot continue to sponsor you if you want to try casually drinking. And so that's how that relationship ended. And I casually drank, never getting past the level of buzzed for gosh, like maybe a year and a half. And in that time realized that I do have more say. Like it's not like a disease that I have. Like I don't have an allergy to alcohol. Like, I'm not having an allergic reaction right now. So the root problem was my trauma, was, that mom-sized hole inside of me. And I was medicating that through alcohol and drugs. Well, once that started to be resolved, that hole, the alcohol and the drugs were no longer as needed. It's almost like taking ibuprofen when you don't have pain. And so I no longer felt the need to go to these meetings. I no longer felt the need to have a sponsor that I check in with. And then while I was casually drinking, I no longer felt the need to drink. So now I don't drink by choice, by preference. I would rather be able to say I'm totally sober and I've overcome my childhood trauma than to say, yeah, I'll take a beer. And I think that is a preference of my own. And yeah, I think that the 12-step program can be incredibly helpful for somebody that needs structure and rigidity and needs it now.
I appreciate the way you described that initially and for many years that was so helpful to you as a person who was not provided that structure, that safety structure. But then as you became to feel more safe in yourself and your own body and your own decisions and your own capacity, that became somewhat stifling rather than protective.
Yeah, it was almost as if I outgrew it, and it became, I don't know if this is what stifling means, but it became a ceiling and I was taller than the room.
Nice. Which is ideal, right? I mean, that's, I think, maybe part of one of the things I don't particularly like about the language, and that this is supposed to define you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
But really, it can be a program that is exactly what you need. But then I think ideally, you don't need it anymore, like your ibuprofen metaphor.
Right.
It's not something that it has to be true of you for the rest of your life, or that it's not true at all. It's not this binary choice.
Yeah, I think another parallel, and this could be fairly controversial, but is welfare. These kind of programs are meant to help people when they need it, to help them get on their feet and to start building a structure or a foundation around them to be able to hold the weight of life. Whereas a lot of times in my experience as a child with both of my parents receiving benefits for my whole life, that's not what it was meant for. They could have done something different and probably been a lot happier and healthier people if they hadn't relied on welfare. I understand that there are different circumstances and different environments, but I think that my childhood could have changed a lot if my dad had a job. if he would have been doing something to build that follow through I talked about that I built with buying a house and paying my bills and showing up to work. If he would have been doing that for himself, I think he would have been a lot happier of a man, and he may still even be alive today. And same with my mom. And these programs are there to help us get on our feet and help us start making the changes we need to make to stand on our own. And if we continue to walk on a crutch after the fracture is healed, then other things are going to start to fail.
They start to define who you are.
Yes.
Rather than help you become who you are meant to be.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of identifying with having depression and okay, well I'll just take an antidepressant for the rest of my life. There we go. That's the solution, as opposed to getting to the root of why depression was there.
So one thing that you mentioned again in your write-up that you have come to understand or appreciate is the value of forgiveness. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think we've all heard that old saying about, having a grudge or resentment is like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yeah.
I don't know where forgiveness started for me. I don't know if I forgave my mom and my dad first, or if I started forgiving me first, or maybe they began happening all together. I think that when I started making amends with people and recognizing that I was worth forgiving, even down to when I had overdosed and I apologized to my sister, I realized that I was holding these resentments against myself that other people weren't even holding on to. My sister wasn't angry with me for almost dying. And so the power of forgiveness is that, maybe another metaphor is that I had this resentment towards myself and towards my folks that was like a huge balloon inside of me. And it was taking up a lot of space, but it was just full of air. It felt so heavy, but it really did nothing but hold me down. I think that forgiveness is multiple choices over time. For me, I could forgive my mom for one action she took, but there are a multitude of actions prior to that I want to work through. And I felt a need to work on forgiveness because of how much it was holding me down and how much space it was taking up in my belly. It reminds me of shame venting. I had so much anger like that reservoir was overflowing. And so if a mother didn't acknowledge their child in public, I become so angry and I'm like losing it because that child is being neglected the way that I was. And it starts boiling over inappropriate places and times. And so forgiveness to me is not clean. It's not, there's not a formula. It feels very moment by moment and situation by situation. Today, I still work on forgiving myself. I forgave myself at the beginning of this podcast because I didn't get all of these apps and things ready to go, and I showed up a couple minutes late. I had to consciously close my eyes and forgive myself and say, like, it's okay. This doesn't deem your worth.
Do you find having to forgive the same things more than once too?
Yeah, almost like a spiral in my head. Like, I'll forgive myself once, but it'll be back in a couple minutes. I'll do it again. It feels like a very living document, like it is alive. Forgiveness is an action word.
That should be one of the 12 steps. That should be the first step.
Right.
I forgive myself. I just want to thank you again for sharing this story. It's so interesting to me because, people who have struggled with codependency, part of what they struggle with often is seeing themselves as not worthy, seeing themselves as not enough. And when you hear stories like yours, Carly, and Brian, and Jason's, and they're just stories of extraordinary people faced with extraordinary challenges and responding to them with such imagination and courage and tenacity. And it's really impressive. I feel very honored that you came and shared with us, Carly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. And thanks for having me. And I want you both to know that for me, you were some folks that had walked in the deep caves that I was very familiar with, but you had a lantern and you lit up those dark caves and helped lead me through. And so I would like to be able to do that same thing for children to come if I have them, and for other people that maybe have experienced these same things. And it feels like a purpose. We didn't go through this stuff for nothing. So let's make purpose of it. And just thank you so much for lighting your lantern and for leading the way.
Well, you're very welcome.